It was supposed to be just another flight, 30,000 feet above the Earth. One man sat alone in the cold silence of the stratosphere, watching the clouds drift beneath him and the curvature of the planet stretch beyond the horizon. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even officially a spy. And yet, on that May morning in 1960, Francis Gary Powers became the man who nearly started World War III when his secret mission went down in flames over the Soviet Union. This is the true story of the U-2 incident, the mission the CIA swore would never fail, and the pilot who paid the price when it did. The year was 1960. The Cold War was at its boiling point. The United States and the Soviet Union weren't just competing, they were preparing for annihilation. In Washington, President Dwight D. Eisenhower wanted information, not rumors, not reports, but hard proof of what the Soviets were building. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev was promising the world that communism would outlive capitalism. He bragged of new weapons, missiles that could reach any corner of the globe. But there was one problem. The US had no eyes inside the Soviet Union, no satellites yet, no reliable spies, only fear. So the CIA turned to something new, something revolutionary, a jet so advanced, so secret, that even the Pentagon didn't fully understand it. Its name, the U-2, built by Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works under the direction of genius engineer Kelly Johnson, the U-2 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It could soar at 70,000 feet, far above the range of Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft missiles. It carried cameras so powerful they could read license plates from the edge of space. To Washington, it was the perfect spy plane, invisible, untouchable, unstoppable. To Moscow, it was an insult. For 4 years, the U-2 had flown undetected over the Soviet Union, photographing missile sites, nuclear facilities, and air bases. Each flight was a gamble. If one ever went down, the US could deny everything. The pilot would carry a suicide needle, a poisoned coin, so he could take his own life if captured. That was the deal. No trace, no evidence, no witness. And that's where Francis Gary Powers entered the story. Born in Virginia, Powers wasn't your typical spy. He was quiet, polite, and deeply loyal. A former Air Force pilot, he was recruited by the CIA in 1956 for the U-2 program. He loved flying. He believed in his mission, but even he knew the danger. If something went wrong, the US would disavow him. He wouldn't exist. Still, Powers accepted every time he took off. He carried America's most dangerous secret and the weight of a potential world war on his shoulders. The mission was simple, at least on paper. Powers would take off from Peshawar, Pakistan, fly deep into Soviet territory, photograph key military sites, and land in Norway. It was a long, lonely flight, more than 3,000 miles through the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. What no one knew was that the Soviets had been waiting. Their radar technology had advanced. Their missiles were faster. They were ready. As Powers' U-2 streaked across the Soviet border, alarms blared in command bunkers from the Caspian Sea to Moscow, the sky filled with interceptors. Below him, the world was watching at 70,000 feet. Powers thought he was untouchable. He'd flown dozens of missions before. The U-2 was slow, but it flew higher than anything else in existence. Then, somewhere near Sverdlovsk, the heart of the Soviet military-industrial zone, the impossible happened. A surface-to-air missile locked on. Powers saw a flash, then a violent explosion ripped through the aircraft. The plane broke apart instantly. Flames engulfed the cockpit. He was thrown violently through the air, the oxygen mask tearing from his face as the U-2 spun downward. Powers made a split-second decision that would haunt him forever. He didn't use the poison needle. He didn't kill himself. He pulled the parachute. When he landed, the silence was deafening. Powers stumbled through a field, dazed, bleeding, trying to destroy what was left of the wreckage. But it was too late. Soviet soldiers surrounded him. Guns raised, Orders shouted. The world's most secret spy plane and its living pilot had just fallen into enemy hands. The Soviets couldn't believe it. For years, they'd been humiliated by American U-2 flights. Now finally, they had proof and a prize. Francis Gary Powers was taken to Moscow, interrogated, and paraded as a living confession of American espionage. In Washington, the CIA and Eisenhower's administration panicked. They had a plan ready. If a U-2 ever went missing, they'd say it was a weather research aircraft that accidentally strayed off course. And that's exactly what they did. On May 3, 1960, the US announced that a NASA weather plane had gone missing near Turkey. The statement was calm, reassuring, believable. Except for one thing, the Soviets already had Powers, and they had the plane. 3 days later, Khrushchev revealed the truth to the world. He mocked the Americans publicly, showing photographs of the wreckage, the intact cameras, and finally, the captured pilot. The world gasped. Eisenhower was forced to admit what everyone now knew. The US had been spying on the Soviet Union from the skies. For a president who built his image on honesty and peace, it was a disaster. Just weeks later, Eisenhower and Khrushchev were scheduled to meet in Paris for a major peace summit, a chance to ease Cold War tensions. Instead, the U-2 incident blew it apart. Khrushchev stormed into the meeting, furious, waving photographs of the wrecked plane. He demanded an apology, the end of all spy flights, and punishment for those responsible. Eisenhower refused to apologize. He took full responsibility, but defended the intelligence gathering. As necessary for national security, Khrushchev walked out. The summit collapsed. The dream of détente and peace between the superpowers went up in flames. Just like the wreckage of Powers' U-2 in Moscow, Powers was put on trial for espionage. It was pure theater, the Soviets' greatest propaganda victory. Powers stood in a glass cage, calm but pale, listening as prosecutors called him a hired spy of American imperialism. He didn't deny it, he couldn't. He admitted he worked for the CIA, but insisted he had no malicious intent. He'd only been doing his job. The Soviet court sentenced him to 10 years in prison, 3 in a cell, 7 in a labor camp. Back home, he became a symbol of controversy. Some Americans called him a hero. Others called him a coward for not using the suicide needle or destroying the plane. The CIA stayed silent. 2 years later, in 1962, the world watched another Cold War crisis unfold, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And behind the scenes, something else was happening. The CIA and the KGB were quietly negotiating. They had something Moscow wanted, and Moscow had something Washington needed. The Soviets held Powers. The Americans held a captured KGB officer, Rudolf Abel, one of the most valuable Soviet agents ever caught on US soil. So, on a cold February morning in Berlin, the two sides made history on the Glienicke Bridge, later called the Bridge of Spies. They met in silence. One man walked from east to west. One man walked from west to east, Francis. Gary Powers was free. When Powers returned to America, he expected celebration. Instead, he was met with suspicion. Politicians questioned his loyalty. Reporters asked why he didn't take his own life. The CIA gave him no hero's welcome, only paperwork and silence. He was cleared of wrongdoing, but the shadow never left him. Powers moved to California, flew test missions, and later became a helicopter pilot for a Los Angeles TV station. He found peace in the sky again until 1977, when his chopper ran out of fuel while covering a news story. He crashed and died on impact. Ironically, the man who survived the deadliest skies of the Cold War lost his life doing what he loved, flying. Decades later, declassified documents revealed how deeply the CIA had underestimated Soviet defenses and how much they had gambled with Powers' life. The U-2 program had provided valuable intelligence, maps of missile sites, nuclear facilities, and military patterns, but at a terrible diplomatic cost. Eisenhower himself had hesitated before authorizing Power's final mission, fearing just such an incident. But by then, the machine of espionage had taken on a life of its own. The US needed information, and Powers was just one man. In a much larger game, the U-2 incident changed everything. It ended the illusion that spies could act without consequence. It shattered trust between nations, reshaped intelligence policy, and set the stage for a new era of surveillance, one fought not by pilots, but by satellites. For the CIA, the lesson was brutal but clear. No spy mission, no matter how high, could ever be completely safe. And for history, Francis Gary Powers became a symbol of duty, of sacrifice, and of the unbearable price of secrecy. So what do you think? Was Francis Gary Powers a hero who did his duty, or a man betrayed by the very country he served? Tell me in the comments, if you were in his place, would you have pulled the parachute or the poison pin? And if you want more true Cold War stories of lies, loyalty, and the secret wars that shaped our world, hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Because in the world of espionage, the truth is never the whole story. Thanks for watching.